A deadly mid-air collision over Delhi. Two passenger planes, carrying a total of 349 people, were flying dangerously close to each other in the skies over Delhi, India. A series of human errors and outdated technology would soon lead to one of the deadliest mid-air collisions in history. This is the story of Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 and Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907. On the evening of November 12, 1996, 289 passengers and 23 crew members boarded a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 in Delhi. The plane was headed to Dhahran International Airport in Saudi Arabia. The flight was scheduled to take about 4 hours and was designated as Flight 763. At the same time, hundreds of kilometers to the northwest, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, with 27 passengers and 10 crew members, was preparing to land in Delhi. The captain of the Saudi flight was 45-year-old Khalid al-Shubaili, a highly experienced pilot with nearly 10,000 flight hours. He had flown this route many times and was familiar with Delhi's complex airspace. The co-pilot was 44-year-old Nazir Khan, a U.S. national with over 7,000 hours of flying time. The flight engineer, Ahmed Al-Adel, aged 33, was the least experienced, with just over 3,000 flight hours. After completing their pre-flight checks and boarding all passengers, Flight 763 pushed back from the gate at 6:20 p.m. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan Flight 1907 was descending toward Delhi about 90 nautical miles, 170 kilometers, from the airport. The aircraft was only 4 years old, a type Ilyushin IL-76, but the onboard technology was outdated. The cockpit was split into 2 levels to fit the 10 crew members. In the upper cockpit sat Captain Alexander Cherepanov, 45 years old, co-pilot Ermek Zanjirov, 37, flight engineer Alexander Chuprov, 50, radio operator Igor Alexeyevich Rapin, 41. In the lower cockpit was navigator Zhanabek Batirov, 51. All crew members were experienced, with even the least experienced having nearly 7,000 hours of flying time. However, their English skills were poor, which would become a serious problem. At 6:33 p.m., as the plane approached Delhi, Air Traffic Control, ATC, instructed Kazakhstan Flight 1907 to descend to 18,000 feet. The radio operator confirmed the instruction and was responsible for all communication with ATC during approach and landing. In 1996, all aircraft flying to or from Delhi had to use an unusual route due to India's airspace being split between civilian and military control. Civilian planes were not allowed in military airspace, and vice versa. Delhi's airport was especially affected, with most nearby airspace still under military control. The only way civilian planes could enter or leave Delhi was through a narrow air corridor, extending 330 kilometers west of the airport to a waypoint called Laldika. At that moment, Kazakhstan Flight 1907 was flying into Delhi along this corridor, while Saudi Flight 763 was about to fly out along the same path. Delhi air traffic controllers had long protested this dangerous system, but nothing had changed. At 6:33 p.m., just as the Kazakhstan crew acknowledged their descent, the Saudi pilots lined up their Boeing 747 on the runway and began takeoff. Moments later, Flight 763 took off into the night sky.
Moments before disaster. After takeoff, the crew of Saudi Arabian Flight 763 switched their radio to Delhi approach control and made their first contact. The air traffic controller in charge of all arrivals and departures at Delhi Airport was V.K. Dutta. He identified the Saudi plane on his radar and instructed it to climb initially to 10,000 feet. Just like the pilots of the Kazakhstan aircraft, the controller was working with very outdated technology. The radar system Dutta was using had not changed much since the 1960s. It did not receive any data directly from the aircraft. Instead, it relied on radar signals sent out from a ground antenna. When these signals bounced back off aircraft, the radar could detect their location but not their altitude, and it couldn't identify the specific aircraft either. As a result, the controller had to trust the pilots to accurately report their altitudes. Delhi had long planned to upgrade to modern radar systems, but bureaucratic delays had prevented this. The controller's plan was simple. He would keep the Kazakhstan aircraft at a higher altitude, letting the Saudi plane climb beneath it. The Saudi Boeing 747 continued its climb to 10,000 feet, while the Kazakhstan aircraft was descending through 23,000 feet, aiming for 18,000 feet. It was now just 70 nautical miles, about 130 kilometers from the airport. The radio operator sitting behind the pilots in the Kazakhstan cockpit reported their position to air traffic control. The controller responded by clearing them to descend further to 15,000 feet and asked them to report when they reached that altitude. The radio operator confirmed the instruction, and Flight 1907 continued its descent. At this point, both aircraft were on the same radio frequency, meaning the pilots could hear each other's communication with air traffic control. This is an important part of situational awareness, especially in busy airspace near airports. Listening to others helps pilots build a mental picture of the traffic around them. In the Kazakhstan cockpit, the pilots and the radio operator began a discussion. Since the controller had given an altitude in feet, but the cockpit instruments mainly showed altitude in meters, they needed to convert 15,000 feet to meters. This was crucial because the co-pilot, who was flying the aircraft, only had a meter-based altimeter. Only the captain's altimeter and the one in the lower cockpit, used by the navigator, showed feet. The radio operator checked his conversion chart and told the pilots that 15,000 feet equals 4,570 meters. The pilots confirmed this and continued their descent. 1 minute later, just after clearing Kazakhstan Flight 1907 to 15,000 feet, the controller received a message from the Saudi pilots. They reported that they were level at 10,000 feet and requested permission to climb further. The controller cleared them to climb to 14,000 feet. This was the closest the controller would allow the two planes to get, just 1,000 feet apart vertically. His plan was to let the Saudi aircraft pass below the Kazakhstan aircraft, then give new instructions to both planes. To be sure, the Kazakhstan radio operator double-checked the feet-to-meters conversion with the navigator in the lower cockpit. The navigator confirmed it was correct. However, the radio operator, despite being the only crew member in contact with air traffic control, did not have his own altimeter. To check the plane's altitude, he had to lean over to see the pilot's instruments. At this moment, the two planes were only minutes from their crossing point. The Saudi plane was climbing, while the Kazakhstan plane was descending. Right on schedule, the Saudi crew reported that they were approaching 14,000 feet and asked to continue climbing. The controller, however, told them to maintain their current altitude. He planned for them to stay at 14,000 feet, while the Kazakhstan aircraft passed 1,000 feet above at 15,000 feet. The Saudi pilots knew there was another aircraft approaching, but they weren't concerned. They had landed and taken off from Delhi many times and had never experienced a serious incident. A few minutes later, they leveled off at 14,000 feet as instructed. In the passenger cabin behind them, no one had any idea that just a few miles away, another plane was racing toward them, hidden behind clouds. In the next few seconds, a chain of events would unfold that would shake global confidence in the safety of India's airspace.
The collision. The air traffic controller asked Kazakhstan Flight 1907 to confirm its position relative to the airport. The radio operator replied that they were at 15,000 feet and 46 kilometers from the airport. Strangely, while the distance was accurate, the altitude was not. The aircraft was actually still descending through 16,400 feet and would need about 1 more minute to reach 15,000 feet. The controller told them to maintain 15,000 feet and warned them that at their 12 o'clock, 10 miles away, a Saudi Boeing 747 was approaching. The two aircraft would pass within 5 miles of each other. The controller asked if they could see the other aircraft.
In the Kazakhstan cockpit, the pilots began talking, trying to visually spot the Saudi plane. On a clear day, they would likely have seen the aircraft's lights through the windshield. But that evening, thick clouds blocked their view. Then things began to unravel. As seconds passed, the crew kept searching for the Saudi plane, but began descending below their cleared altitude of 15,000 feet for reasons that are still unclear. The Kazakhstan plane entered the same cloud bank as the Saudi aircraft. Now both planes were flying directly toward each other at combined speeds exceeding 1,000 kilometers per hour. Why the Kazakhstan aircraft descended below its cleared altitude remains a mystery. Some believe the pilots misunderstood the controller's mention of 14,000 feet, the Saudi plane's level, and thought they were being told to descend to that height. Others suggest the co-pilot, using a Soviet-style meter-based altimeter, may not have followed or even heard the earlier feet-to-meters conversion and didn't know what altitude he was supposed to maintain. It's possible he knew they were supposed to stay at 15,000 feet, but didn't know that meant 4,570 meters. Had both planes been equipped with a traffic collision avoidance system, TCAS, they would have been warned in time to avoid the crash. But TCAS was not mandatory outside the US at the time. Meanwhile, in the control tower, the controller had no way of knowing that the dot on his screen was not following his instructions. His radar showed position, but not altitude. The Saudi pilots, listening in on the frequency, heard the controller's conversation with the Kazakhstan crew, but like the controller, they had no idea that the other aircraft was not actually at 15,000 feet. As seconds ticked by, the two planes closed the distance, hidden in clouds. At 6:39 p.m., the Kazakhstan radio operator shouted, "Maintain altitude." He may have seen an instrument showing they were too low. Unbelievably, the captain then asked, "What altitude were we cleared to?" With just 18 seconds to impact, the flight engineer shouted, "Maintain." The radio operator shouted again, "Maintain 15,000 feet. Don't descend." The captain finally realized the terrible mistake, switched off the autopilot, and ordered the co-pilot to increase thrust and climb. Just then, the crew saw the Saudi plane's lights, but it was too late. The tail of the Kazakhstan aircraft struck the left engine of the Saudi Boeing 747. The impact caused an instant explosion. Both planes flew for a few more seconds trailing fire, then broke apart in mid-air and fell to the ground in flames. In the control tower, the controller saw the two blips on his radar screen merge, then disappear. Moments later, he heard Arabic voices on the radio, but got no response from either aircraft. He called again and again. There was no reply. Just 1 minute after the collision, both aircraft hit the ground. All 349 people on board were killed. It remains the deadliest mid-air collision in aviation history and the third worst air disaster ever recorded. Aftermath and investigation. After the crash, each party blamed the other. The official investigation found that the Kazakhstan crew's failure to maintain altitude played the critical role. Inside the crowded, outdated cockpit, no one seemed to take full responsibility for ensuring the aircraft remained at the correct altitude. There were also major technological shortcomings on the Kazakhstan aircraft. No traffic collision avoidance system, no basic altitude alert sounds, standard on Western jets since the 1960s, no autopilot altitude capture mode, which would automatically level off at a preset altitude. Any one of these missing systems could have prevented the crash. Combined with the underfunded and outdated airspace infrastructure, this tragedy was almost inevitable. Legacy. As a direct result of the crash, India became the second country in the world after the US to mandate TCAS in its airspace by 1999. Many other countries soon followed. Today, TCAS is a global standard. Delhi Airport and India's airspace system also underwent massive modernization. Today, all major Indian airports use modern radar, and most surrounding airspace has been transferred from military to civilian control. This accident was a tragedy, but it also triggered changes that have saved countless lives.